Hello, and welcome to Connected by Controversy. I'm your host, Chris White, and our topic today is the role of the U.S. in the world, broadly speaking. As a former Marine infantryman myself, I joined with aspirations of becoming a police officer back in 1994, thinking it would be a leg up for being hired after my service. Along the way, I had some amazing experiences, but decided law enforcement wasn't for me. So I worked on my degree in Spanish education, then got a PhD in Latin American history. Well, about 2 weeks into my grad school studies in 2001, that's when 9/11 happened. And this really shaped my outlook over the next couple of decades. I tried reading as many voices from people on both sides of the debate over the best way to respond to terrorism. And my perspective was solidly on the side that opposed it. So what's so controversial about today's topic is that we're dealing with something that I think both of us, my guest and myself included, think is a fundamental issue for American identity. We like to believe in the idea as Americans, US citizens, what have you, that we're simultaneously the best people who've ever walked the earth, as well as the toughest. And that's a difficult kind of dichotomy to balance. We believe in Hollywood versions of Americanism. We believe in many things about ourselves, and yet we oftentimes don't want to hear the truth about ourselves. The truths oftentimes are great too, but the consequences of the American way of life are beyond examination for so many of us. It's a very difficult topic. And our guest today has the experience and the education to state the problems of the US role in the world more eloquently than anyone I've read. I received my PhD in 2005 at the University of Kansas, was hired on at Marshall University in West Virginia in 2006, and had two twin baby boys. Actually, they were about a month old when we first moved here. So that was a lot of pressure on me and my wife to, make things work here in a new setting. Well, shortly after arriving, a colleague of mine who was a senior professor at Marshall, who also shared my outlook, introduced me to the work of Dr. Andrew Bacevich. And it was like a breath of fresh air, really, because I didn't know very many other veterans who were also historians who took a critical look at the U.S. And this is a delicate position to take because we can be accused of many things. But the research is really what Dr. Bacevich had in his corner and his experience. So my colleague said that Dr. Bacevich was a former Army colonel and a PhD in history teaching at Boston University, with several books that were critical of U.S. militarism. And I've since read 7 of his books: The Limits of Power, The New American Militarism, Breach of Trust, which is probably my favorite of all of them, Washington Rules, America's War for the Greater Middle East, and his 2 most recent ones, The Age of Illusions and After the Apocalypse. Today, I'd like to talk to Dr. Bacevich about his military career and his writing and teaching to give listeners a sense of the broad scope of his life's work. Welcome to the show, Dr. Bacevich.
Well, thank you very much for having me.
Well, this is really an honor for me, a treat for me too, because when I was talking to my colleague, Dr. Bob Sowery, back in 2007 or 8, you had a couple of books out at the time, and I just kind of hit the ground rolling. Whenever a new one would come out every year or so, then I'd pick it up. And in fact, I'd like to say too, my wife really wanted to be on the call too. She's actually an educator, but she's working right now, and she's assigned Breach of Trust to several of her social work classes in the past.
Great. Yeah,
so I'm going to include some of her questions too. And where are we talking to you today?
I'm at home in Walpole, Massachusetts, which is a suburb of Boston.
Okay. I think last time we communicated a couple of years ago, you might have been in Missouri. Is that right? Or Illinois or something? No? Okay.
Well, we've been living here ever since 1998, not in the same house, but always in Walpole, which is like a 40-minute drive to the BU campus, where I no longer teach, but where I did teach for 16 years.
Right. Okay. So the first thing I wanted to start off with is what exactly motivated you to join the Army back in the mid-1960s when you went to West Point?
Well, I was born and grew up in the Midwest. Born in Illinois, grew up in Indiana. Both my parents were World War II veterans. And I think because of We also were a Catholic family, seriously Catholic. And I think that the entire environment in which I was raised was one that took seriously, found merit in military service to country. I wouldn't say I was propagandized on that score, but it was just it was in the environment in which I grew up. And of course, this is during the Cold War, when I think there was a lot of patriotic fervor in the country, not a heck of a lot of questioning about why the Cold War had come about and whether or not the policies that we were pursuing made sense, were advanced the national interest, were moral. When I finished high school, I went to both Catholic elementary school and Catholic high school. I had some options for college, but I got an appointment to the military academy, which seemed very attractive at the time. And so I accepted it, So I was a cadet at West Point from 1965 to 1969. The years of the buildup and of the principal combat in Vietnam during the Vietnam War. By the time I graduated, the process of withdrawal had already begun. So by the time I got to Vietnam in 1970, my classmates and I got to Vietnam in 1970, it was pretty clear, I think, to most of us, maybe all of us, that we were not participating in a conflict that was going to have a happy ending. And that sort of set me on my way. I could have got out of the Army after a few years. My wife and I decided to stay. We had children, mouths to feed. Economy wasn't particularly conducive to making the kind of move that you described yourself making. It's kind of one thing comes to another, and suddenly I'm in the Army for 20 years. And then finally decided to make a move and try a different way of life.
Well, my wife and I both met in the military. She was in the Navy and I was in the Marines, and we didn't even discuss re-upping, but we look back on it now and wonder why we didn't at least try to do that, because a lot of people did get quite a bit out of it if they stayed in for 20 years too. And I imagine that you had a lot of other experiences after Vietnam. What were some other things that you did?
So again, most of my time in uniform was during the Cold War. And so the focus after Vietnam was what we called then the Central Region, meaning Europe, the contingency that shaped planning, shaped training, shaped just about everything, was the prospect of a Warsaw Pact invasion into Western Europe. In fact, that contingency was highly unlikely, but it did serve a real purpose after Vietnam, which was to provide a clear answer to the question, why does the Army exist? After Vietnam, as a result of Vietnam, that question was a difficult one, but the Red Army gave us an answer. So even if they were not, as we more or less pretended, that they were on the verge of attacking at a moment's notice, it helped to give us collectively a sense of purpose. Why did I spend 7 years of my life in the Federal Republic of Germany? Well, because we had a major U.S. Army contingent, U.S. military contingent, not just the Army, that was committed to defense of what was then called Western Europe, and I was part of that. Again, we didn't ask a heck of a lot of questions about how that commitment had come about. We didn't ask a heck of a lot of questions about whether or not the Soviets were leaning forward in the saddle as much as we pretended, but it did give us a sense of purpose, and that was tremendously useful in enabling the Army, the rest of the services, but my service was the Army, in enabling the Army to recover from the pathologies of the Vietnam War. As I said, by the time I got to the war, it was already during the drawdown phase, and the Army was in bad shape. bad shape in terms of discipline, in terms of rampant drug abuse, racial problems, all kinds of disciplinary issues, and the refocusing after Vietnam on the possibility of a hot war with the Warsaw Pact played a crucial role in enabling the Army to recover its bearings. And frankly, that process really defines most of what my time in uniform was all about.
But did you have the sense at the time at all that the kind of sense that you have now, which is that we probably weren't actually as threatened as it seemed like at the time, or as they were presenting it at the time?
If I had sat down and thought seriously about that proposition, I probably would have developed my own doubts. But it was more convenient. I wanted to be part of the team, and the team was about rebuilding the United States Army. The team was about flushing out the problems, the poisons that the Army had become imbued with as a consequence of Vietnam. And so that was our collective focal point, and that was my focal point. And, I had accepted, I think, the worldview that was inculcated in members of the officer corps. I said I went to West Point. West Point is not a college. West Point, my classmates would say we got a good education. I really don't think we did. I don't think I did, at least. I think what I experienced and what they experienced was a process of socialization to embrace a particular hierarchy of values, to accept a particular worldview, not to ask a heck of a lot of first order questions, but again, to become part of the team. And it was only when I got out of the Army in 1992, and it didn't happen overnight, but I began a process of asking first order questions and of thinking more critically about America's role in the world, to include more critically about the Vietnam War and how the Vietnam War came about and its consequences. And I think that different point of view then very much informed the writing that I began to do once I was out of uniform.
So this is something that is very interesting, I think, to a lot of people, including myself, where you have this experience while you're in, where you're kind of keeping your head down in a way, like you said, trying to do what you can to keep your job and build the team back together. But then you have your life afterwards, which is dedicated to scholarship, and you're kind of reflecting back on the history of the time that you actually served. And so what I'm wondering is, when you were doing your research, was part of it motivated by the fact that you had been fighting in the Cold War? Did you still feel some kind of were you able to look at it objectively at all?
Well, I like to think so.
Yeah.
Who knows if other people would agree with that? But I think there's a key factor here that we haven't touched on yet. And that is that I got out of the Army basically when the Cold War ended. Not precisely. The Berlin Wall comes down in the fall of '89. I don't get out of the Army until 1992. But the end of the Cold War gave rise to a sense of euphoria that particularly affected, I think, the national security establishment. And I say establishment, I mean senior civilian officials, senior military officers, more broadly, probably the officer corps in general, commentators, journalists. The Cold War seemed to have ended in a transformative victory. The Cold War seemed to have ended history. End of the Cold War seemed to have ended history. Famous article and book by Francis Fukuyama. End of the Cold War seemingly vindicated everything that the United States had done in waging the Cold War, and by extension, everything that the United States had done even prior to the Cold War. And I had a difficult time with those claims. So I think it was what sort of tipped me over from being a mostly team player who was somewhat skeptical of what the team claimed to represent and to do, but tipped me over into somebody who was more sharply critical of what the team claimed to be about, was the end of the Cold War. And so in a sense, it was very liberating for me to be out of the Army at a moment in history which I think, for me at least, invited critical thinking. And that's what then caused me, as I began to write, to focus on issues such as the underlying impulse, imperatives, causes, roots of U.S. foreign policy, led me to become more critical of civil-military relations. And those became abiding sort of themes of the writing that I then began to do increasingly. And I lucked out by getting a job in academia, where I hope I did a good job, but I wasn't working as hard as I worked in the Army, and had the freedom and the encouragement to think and to think critically. So, what I ended up doing was not so much a product of some grand plan that worked out. I think it was fortuitous. Things happened to break a particular way, and that presented me with opportunities for which I even today, am very, very grateful. But it wasn't because I had the whole thing plotted out in advance.
Right. Well, I think that it gives you a lot of credibility in a way that a lot of other authors maybe wouldn't have. And the way that you present information too it doesn't seem to me like it's from a dissident writer's perspective. It's more of it's a very complete perspective. I'm speaking, for example, the book Breach of Trust could be, I wonder how people actually receive that, especially veterans. I know my wife, that's the question she had. She has assigned Breach of Trust before. And there have been veterans in the class who kind of take issue with certain things, but it's not as if you were presenting the information incorrectly. It's just that they don't like to hear it. I think they don't like to hear the idea that an all volunteer military is kind of problematic. That this is that they actually prefer the all volunteer military. A lot of these veterans do. Can you talk about how you've been received by veterans in particular?
I don't know. I mean, I think the honest answer is, I'm contacted by some veterans who say, "Hey, I read what you wrote," and it would say, "I agree. Thank you very much." Occasionally, not as frequently, I'm contacted by people who say, "I read what you wrote, and I, profoundly disagree." Mm-hmm. But not for a second would I claim to some kind of a sample of response that gives me an understanding of how what I write or what I say is viewed by veterans. And I must tell you that I don't write in particular for an audience of veterans. I don't. It took me a while to. It's easy to take off the uniform. Mm-hmm. It's not as easy to set aside the mindset that I had come to embrace over the period of my socialization at West Point and my years of service. It took a while for that to happen. I think it's good that it happened. But as a consequence of it happening, I don't think of myself as a Army guy. I mean, I know I am a veteran. I know I served, but I mean, it does seem to me that there are particularly career people, once they embrace that identity of being a Marine, being a soldier, being an airman, that identity identifies them, defines them for the rest of their lives, long after they've taken off the uniform. That's their choice. I think it can have unfortunate consequences, because if that happens to you, you're kind of a prisoner then. You're in a box. And I've tried to, it's a cliche coming, I've tried to think outside the box, which requires me to think of myself as something other than a soldier. I don't think I was a soldier. I no longer think of myself as a soldier in any respect whatsoever.
I really appreciate what you just said there, because it does seem like there's more of a distinction between people who want to consider themselves veterans, for like the old saying of once a Marine, always a Marine, has kind of always bothered me too. But at the same time, it's it encourages camaraderie too. If you meet somebody who's a fellow veteran, then you have something in common,
yeah.
right?
Yeah, and let us stipulate that I think there are many people for whom their time in uniform, whether in combat service or simply, military service in peacetime, that's a defining episode in their life. When they spent 3 years in Germany, or they spent a year in Korea, and they saw things that were different before they headed back to the farm in Iowa. And those experiences, I think, stick with people. There's nothing wrong with that. As long as it, in my mind, as long as it doesn't kind of become a prison.
Well, and going back to breach of trust, you start the book off with a situation, it was a baseball game, I believe, right, at Fenway.
Yeah.
Can you talk about that scene and kind of
how
that's a good introduction?
I'm certainly not the only one who thinks this, but I do. I am bothered by the rituals that have become part of American life that we enact as a way, we, the American people, enact as a way of demonstrating our support for the troops. And on the one hand, I don't want to question the sincerity of our fellow citizens who like to recite their support for the troops. On the other hand, there's something contrived about it. There's something very thin about it. And I've been quite critical of that. And I guess what it comes down to is that, is that great phrase coined by Dietrich Bonhoeffer, cheap grace. Cheap grace is acting in ways to endow self with a sense of sanctity, of righteousness, without paying the price, without paying any price. And I think there's at the essence, at the center of the existing civil-military relationship, and I use the phrase meaning the relationship between the military and the people, there's a heck of a lot of cheap grace that's being claimed by the American people. I do believe emphatically that the American people need to support our fellow citizens who serve in the armed forces of the United States, but they should do it critically. In other words, we need to care about where the troops go and what they're sent to do and with what consequences. I mean, when we think about the wars that have occurred in the aftermath of 9/11, principally Iraq and Afghanistan, but not only Iraq and Afghanistan, the consequences of these conflicts have been catastrophic. Catastrophic in many cases for the people we have supposedly sent our troops off to liberate and save and democratize, but catastrophic for the troops, our troops themselves, killed, maimed, many affected. We all know them, PTSD and the like. And I think the country as a whole has been adversely affected. If when you begin to ask yourself, well, where did this phenomenon called Trumpism come from? What causes Americans to have the attitudes that led to the January 6th insurrection? I think a major answer to that is our misguided military policies. And the American people choose to play the role of spectators. I think it's deeply wrong. It is undemocratic. And that's my gripe. That's my gripe when there's these ceremonies at Fenway Park or wherever else before the ball game, in which we all feel good because we salute the flag, pledge allegiance, cheer for the troops, and then somebody says play ball, and we move on. I think that is outrageous, and it's an abdication on our part as citizens of our obligation to the troops, our real obligation. Our real obligation is not to applaud. Our real obligation is to care so much about the troops that we hold our political leadership and our military leadership accountable for where the troops go and what they do. And there's been almost zero accountability on that score since 9/11. Now, Congress just recently authorized the creation of an Afghanistan War Commission that will investigate the Afghanistan war. Not investigate simply the debacle of the evacuation from Kabul, but investigate the entire war, the military conduct of the war, the political oversight, the intelligence aspect, the reconstruction efforts undertaken on behalf of the Afghan people, the whole ball of wax. I don't know, I can't say, we can't say how well this commission is going to do its work, but if it does its work well, then we will have at least one element of accountability that will be restored, and that would be a good thing. We ain't there yet, but I think there are some hopeful signs.
Accountability actually was one of the topics of a previous podcast with Philip Sheenan, who was looking at the 9/11 Commission and the Warren Commission. And it seems like this is a problem with the federal government too, that you're not going to necessarily, you don't want to punish people, the decision makers, because then where does the punishment end? Holding people accountable is a difficult thing to do. And so Sheenan was arguing basically that both of those commissions, while they were correct about who carried out those acts, Oswald, the lone gunman, the 19 hijackers and Al-Qaeda and the 9/11 Commission case, that the failures that took place were not highlighted.
Yeah.
And so this idea of accountability for the Afghanistan Commission would be so important for what reason, to what end?
Well, first of all, I think you're making a very important point, that certainly the Warren Commission, I think to a lesser extent, the 9/11 Commission, partisan considerations entered into deliberations. Also, both of them were undertaken in the immediate wake of the catastrophe. So, in a sense, the mood was not right for asking tough questions and being completely open to the answers. Nonetheless, the example of those two commissions, I think, is a warning of how this Afghanistan War Commission could go wrong, unless we have the right people who are commissioners. Maybe I'm naive on this score, but I think if we have the right people and if they do their jobs well, then we can come to some hard truths. And the issue here is not that let's go find some four-star generals that we can publicly embarrass. The issue here is not that people are going to get sent to jail. But I think, and maybe this is my naivete, there is value in coming to the truth. I mean, you're a historian. I know, history is a never-ending argument. Even things that seem to be settled are not really settled, because a new generation of historians come along and they got a different angle of vision and they ask different questions. They decide that what we thought we knew about this particular event may not be explicitly wrong, but it's not important. And so we have new questions posed, new research undertaken, and we come to new answers. It's never ending. But I guess historians I believe, as somebody who used to be a historian, that at least incrementally, we come a little bit closer to truth. We need to come to truth, some semblance of truth about US policy prior to and after 9/11. And I think the Afghanistan War Commission could, maybe make a real contribution to coming closer to the truth. I think you may disagree, but I mean, I think we live in a time of enormous crisis. I'm not talking about the crisis of Ukraine or the crisis of Taiwan. Those certainly qualify as crisis. Crisis of the climate, that certainly qualifies as a crisis. But there's a crisis of democracy here in our country. And the lying has become flagrant. Nor do I simply blame the Trump camp for the lying. God knows there's plenty of lies coming from the Trumpers. But there's been all kinds of dishonesty on the part of liberals, if you want to use that characterization, or of the Democratic Party. So there's a desperate need, I think, for honesty in our politics. And again, I think that the Afghanistan War Commission could make a real contribution there. Whether it will or not remains to be seen. But I think it can do important work.
And is there something that you can identify in the American, either the political system or in American culture, that makes it difficult for us to see the truth?
Yeah, American exceptionalism.
Yeah.
I mean, so my basic interpretation of America's role in the world, going back to the revolution, is that we have pursued a strategy. And the strategy can be called opportunistic expansionism. That's not a very felicitous phrase. But when you ask yourself, how the heck did we go from 1776, being 13 rather small and not very impressive states along the eastern seaboard, to 1945, which is not that long time, where we are by then the richest, most powerful country in the world? The answer is not isolationism. The answer is that generations of American statesmen made choices for how to expand American power and wealth. They seized opportunities. The opportunities came in all kinds of forms. Napoleon wanted to ditch Louisiana. So Thomas Jefferson said, great, we'll buy it. Seward says, we'll buy Alaska. And there are other episodes where he said, we're going to take it. James Polk was insistent that the cornerstone of his presidency was going to be to establish the presence of the United States on the Pacific coast. And that meant taking California from Mexico by hook or by crook. So it was not a strategy in the sense that each successive administration subscribed to the same, book of 5 little points. But I think there was a common understanding of seizing the moment in order to increase American power and increase American wealth. Opportunistic expansionism. Now, what made us different, perhaps, than the calculating statesmen of Germany or of France or of Great Britain is that we overlaid the strategy of opportunistic expansionism with claims of virtue. That what we were doing was to expanding the realm of freedom. What we were doing was widening democracy, improving democracy. That's what really defined the essence of the American project. And those claims, the claims of American exceptionalism, are deeply rooted in our collective psyche as Americans, even today in the 21st century. And therefore, it makes it that much more difficult to come to a truthful understanding, let's say, of what US policy in the world has been about since the end of the Cold War. The end of the Cold War seemingly signaled the ultimate triumph of freedom and democracy as embodied by the United States of America. And that triumph seemed to empower us to continue this mission, to bring it to its logical conclusion, which would be the universal triumph of American-style freedom and democracy. And that expectation then empowered us, in our own judgment, to undertake a whole series of misguided initiatives that followed, down to the present moment, most of which really resulted in the militarization of US policy with ill effects and great costs, but propped up by this belief in American exceptionalism. That we hear that from virtually every politician in Washington. Not everyone, but you'll hear that from President Biden. President Biden's not a stupid man, but he has drunk from the fountains of American exceptionalism for so long that really he's not capable, I think, of questioning the premises.
And I'm hearing in my own mind, maybe my former self, before I started reading history, a response would be along the lines of, well, wouldn't it be best to behave in a way that we are exceptional in the world, because somebody has to be the most powerful in the world. Is there any type of usefulness that you see? I don't mean that you would agree with it, but usefulness, like in the sense of that it allows for the survivability from like almost from a mimetic perspective, like the Dawkins idea of mimetic of memes, where you have these ideas that can keep perpetuating themselves because they have inherent traits of survivability.
Well, I would say depends on the circumstance, but yeah, maybe yes, sometimes. In other words, we, the people, we Americans, tend to subscribe to a rather oversimplified narrative about the origins of World War II. World War II really, even today, I think the formative, the most important event in world history, the principal justification for present-day American exceptionalism. So we subscribe to this simplified narrative, which helps to uphold American exceptionalism. And you might argue that there was a time when that was useful. It was necessary for the United States to participate in the defeat of the Japanese Empire and the destruction of the Third Reich. Absolutely necessary. And therefore, it was helpful to dress it up in the garb of American exceptionalism. Perhaps even in the immediate wake of World War II, given the damage that World War II had done to the international order, given that the position that it had left the United States as the preeminent status quo power, perhaps you could argue it was necessary for us to now take those American exceptionalist arguments and apply them to US relations with the Soviet Union. In other words, importing the idea of American exceptionalism as a rationale for the Cold War. Perhaps that was necessary back in 1947 and 48 and 49. I think today it's not simply not, is it not necessary, but it is deeply, deeply, deeply damaging to ourselves and to others for us to imagine that we are exceptional. Among other things, it gets in the way of a more serious understanding of World War II and of the Cold War, because it wasn't. Probably need to hit your record button again. I have a phone here. I shouldn't have it in my office. But so it's not that American exceptionalism is always misleading. I think today it is not simply misleading, but I think today it has very nefarious effects on how we position ourselves in history today, and therefore how we define our role in the world. Of course, how do you, can you turn American exceptionalism on in the wake of the attack on Pearl Harbor and then turn it off in the aftermath of Hiroshima and Nagasaki? Not easily done. It seems that what we in fact have done is embraced it as a people, embraced it so thoroughly that we can't even recognize that it's an artifice.
And yeah, this is the kind of conversation I wanted to have with you about, because I kind of go back and forth myself too. I try to see some of the good and say, well, and I imagine, is it possible that we are a force for good in general in the world, but then it's impossible to ignore the very real history of things like Vietnam and interventions in Central America and post and pre 9/11 interventions in the Middle East. And there's just so many of these problems that accrue. And it seems like it takes a long time to get the average citizen to even entertain those ideas, in part because that American exceptionalism is preventing them from even spending the time with something that's very difficult. It seems like it's going to be too difficult, or that it's coming from an extreme perspective and therefore they don't want to hear it.
Yeah, I think you're putting your finger on something that's very important.
And
life is not easy.
Yeah.
You got a family. Life can be tough. Paying the bills, raising the kids, dealing with the atmosphere in which the kids are growing up. Well, let's throw COVID on top of that. Let's throw the economic, chaos created by COVID on top of that. Americans have a lot on their minds, and therefore, this is to your point exactly. If as historians, as educators, who say, well, please sit down because I want you to completely rethink your understanding of the origins and consequences of World War II. Their response is, are you kidding me? I'm too busy. And I don't think we should then say, well, that's okay. But the challenges, I think, we've got a big country. What's our population now? Over 330, something like 340 million.
Yeah.
The challenges of bringing about a more truthful and relevant understanding of our past are really, really difficult. And then we have, I hope I don't get myself in trouble here, but then we have something like the 1619 Project, a demand for a reckoning about race in America, completely legitimate and appropriate, but going a step further in proposing a completely different framing of the past. I think that framing, I understand where it comes from, but I think it has its own defects, which ultimately will not contribute to bringing us back together as a nation, and could in fact simply deepen the cleavages that divide us. I mean, I think there's evidence already that the 1619 Project basically plays into the hands of the racists. And there are racists in our country, God knows. But I mean, it basically allows racists to argue that they're right. That ain't good. And that really ain't good at this particular moment in our history when the divisions among us are so deep.
Right, and especially because that project has the opposite intention. Right. And that's something that is really important for, I think, people to understand when they're searching for sources that can inform them accurately, but from a critical perspective, is that, you have your Howard Zinns, your Noam Chomsky's, Christian Parenti's, and many others that are out there, but in a lot of ways, those authors turn people off too, and kind of push them to the other side. Do you want to kind of talk about how?
Well, I think I don't mean that I have tried to do that, but I think that's probably the way some people read me.
I see it differently.
I've been compared to Howard Zinn and compared to Noam Chomsky. I don't think the comparisons are appropriate, but
I think the style's very different.
When you write something and put your name on it, you have no ability to control how it's going to be received and interpreted. You just have to acknowledge that you're responsible for the words that have been put on the paper.
Right. Well, that was what was refreshing about reading your work too, because the detail that's in there is so important. It's not the same kind of, the voice behind it is different than when you read a Chomsky or a Zinn too, because and not to criticize their work, but there's just something different about what you're doing, and I think the intentions are different too, and it probably comes across to a more middle of the road audience as more
Well, I
legit.
don't know. I mean, they've sold more books than I have, but I was just thinking as you were saying that when I was working on my PhD dissertation long ago, which was I don't want to get into weeds. It was a biography of an Army officer whose career was as significant with regard to his role in diplomacy as his role as a traditional soldier. And an early chapter dealt with his service in the Philippines in the wake of the Spanish-American War. This is after the United States had crushed the Philippine insurrection. But during a period of time of roughly a decade, when the United States was trying to pacify what was then called the Moro province, mostly the huge island of Mindanao. And the Moros to the present day resist the Philippine government, insisting that they want to govern themselves. They don't want to be part of the Philippines. Well, they didn't want to be part of an American empire either back in the day. And my protagonist was involved in a really ugly counterinsurgency that attempted to pacify the Moros, to get them to accept American authority. An episode that's almost entirely forgotten in terms of the public's awareness of our history. But I came, not that I discovered it, but I confronted the evidence of mass atrocities committed by US troops. This is around like 1905, 1906, killing men, women, and children. Because the Moros were, I mean, as a military force, were primitive, poorly armed, not very well organized. And we just killed them. And that, in a sense, is a moment that began my own process of beginning to think critically. I was a serving officer at the time. I was a captain at the time. But that confronted me with a different way to tell the story. And it was the facts. There's nothing being made up here. And I think we all need to have that moment of awakening when we confront uncomfortable facts. Not only just scholars, but I think as citizens we need to. There's going to be a lot of uncomfortable facts brought to light if this Afghanistan War Commission does its job. Again, we'll see if that plays out the way it should. But there's a lot of uncomfortable facts that are waiting to be uncovered.
And a lot of this has to do, I think, with the legitimacy of the sources from the perspective of the reader. So if people, like in your case, you're actually reading something while you're in the military from somebody who was in the military before, do you think that helps?
And you're reading documents that are in the National Archives.
Yeah. That
were originally produced by U.S. Army officers back in 1905 and 1906. So it wasn't made up.
Right. For me, it was reading Smedley Butler.
Smedley Butler.
Right. And honestly, I've never really looked back since then, because he was touted as one of the, we had to learn about him winning those 2 medals of honor, but then we never learned anything about war as a racket afterwards. What he did after he got out of the Corps. Well,
and also, on Smedley's story, somebody just sent me this new book, Gangsters of Capitalism. Smedley Butler, the Marines, and the Making and Breaking of America's Empire. It is a story, a known story, and yet a half-buried story the U.S. interventions in Nicaragua, Haiti, and the Dominican Republic during the interwar period, and the role played principally by the Marine Corps, not entirely. The Army had a role, the Navy had a role, in what was a nasty bit of policing an empire that had nothing to do with democracy and human rights. And at a time, of course, when most of us were led to believe, the interwar period, were led to believe that US foreign policy was all about isolationism. Well, really? The Nicaraguans, Dominicans, and the Haitians wouldn't have seen it that way because they had the United States Marine Corps with its boot on their necks. And one could cite all kinds of other episodes, but that's the part of the story that gets lost and is deeply unfortunate, because the story we want to tell ourselves is the story of going to war against Nazi Germany and helping to bring about the defeat of Hitler, which is an important story.
Right.
It ain't the only one.
Right. It's not the only one. That's a difficult thing to talk about, too, because in a history class, as you know, you only have so much time. And if you focus on, for a U.S. history survey or world history survey, you got to make choices on what you're going to focus on. And the outcome is going to be different on their minds.
Well, and obviously, World War II is going to get more lessons than Nicaragua.
Right. Well, the difficult thing, I think, is to jibe those two, right? Because if we're talking about Nicaragua and Haiti and Dominican Republic, those types of occupations that the Marines were involved in, how do you jibe that with Iwo Jima? You know, there's not a monument that's 40 feet high to those interventions. And so I think I know when I was in the Marines, we had a barracks in Diego Garcia. I was there for a year, where inside the barracks, there were just plastered on the walls all these different interventions we've been involved in, just named as places, Veracruz, Port-au-Prince, things like that. But there's no explanation behind them. It was almost as if the quantity of the interventions implied how good we were automatically.
Yeah, I've had a similar experience when I went to the Army's Command and General Staff College at Fort Leavenworth. This is back in the early 1980s. At least back then, in the main academic building, they had what were stained glass windows, really, like church windows, that featured, one window on World War II, one window on World War I, one window on the Civil War, and so on. And they had one that was called, I think the title on it was the Philippines Campaign. Well, there were a lot of Philippine campaigns in the Philippines between 1898 and roughly 1912, 1913. I mean, a campaign to oust the Spaniards, a campaign to suppress the Filipino nationalists, multiple campaigns to try to pacify the Moros. And it's a hell of a complicated story. And portraying it in one stained glass window necessarily distorts the reality in a way that's comforting. We can say that what we did in the Philippines was like what we did in World War II. Isn't that great? But not helpful in terms of coming to self-understanding, which is what history ought to do ultimately.
I think that's a good way of putting it. And to kind of round this out, I wanted to bring up a speech that you mentioned in America's War for the Greater Middle East, which the Jimmy Carter's so-called Malaise speech, right? And I've read that section several times, and each time I read it, I wonder if this is one of those examples of an American leader trying to be honest with people and then getting the backlash as a result of it.
Yes, absolutely. No question about it. a prophetic speech, where the prophet himself then, of course, was rejected. But somebody who did not want us to wander into the mire of the Middle East, whether propelled by our need for oil or whether propelled by our unwarranted fears about Soviet expansionism into the Persian Gulf. He warned us, we ignored the warning, and in many respects, the very sad story of US military involvement in the Persian Gulf is what follows. So Carter this is a road not taken speech. And of course, what's ironic, I think, Carter is a very admirable figure in terms of the way he has lived his post-presidential life. But as a president, he's viewed as a failure, as somebody who was weak. And yet that speech was a great gift to the American people that the American people at the time and since have chosen to reject with terrible consequences, I think.
I would agree. And the fact that he actually also was involved in changing U.S. Middle East policy, that even as a somewhat progressive person too.
Well, you're right. We don't let him off the hook, because after when his presidency was on the line, and the Iran hostage crisis was underway, it was Carter who promulgated the so-called Carter Doctrine, which declared that the Persian Gulf was a vital US national security interest and a place we would fight for. And we've been fighting there almost ever since. So on the one hand, he's the prophet who was ignored. On the other hand, he's the president who waded into the mire with terrible consequences. So he doesn't get away with he doesn't get away with his hands clean.
Yeah, and I would recommend anybody who wants to understand why it's been impossible for us to have a coherent policy in the Middle East, or if they're understanding why we have so many enemies too. That book delineates it so well, because what I imagine is, and with each of the responses, it's almost like the tar baby analogy.
Yes.
We're creating more enemies that we didn't
Right.
have before 1979.
Right. Absolutely.
And so, well, I wanted to, there's all kinds of books that you've written too. I listed off a few of them, and recently read your latest two, The Age of Illusions and After the Apocalypse. And I was wondering if you have something else that you're working on right now. I know the latest just came out recently.
So with a young veteran of the Iraq and Afghanistan wars, a guy by the name of Danny Sherson, Danny and I have commissioned a series of essays by Iraq and Afghanistan veterans who in one way or another have become dissenters. And that collection of essays it's now put together. It's in the process of being prepared for publication, and will be published in August of the present calendar year. I don't think it's going to be a bestseller, because edited volumes tend not to be bestsellers. But I do believe that the young veterans who have contributed to this volume have very important things to say about our recent wars, and by extension about U.S. policy in the post-Cold War era. So I hope some people will take note and give it a look.
Can you give us a glimpse of some of those perspectives?
Well, one of the things we tried to do is to cast our net broadly. I mean, there's one essay in particular by a guy, enlisted soldier, 82nd Airborne, who sings the praises of his superiors, of the senior NCOs and the officers, let's say up to the battalion level, that he served with. And yet, he denounces the overall approach to fighting the Iraq War, in essence because the American approach was to elbow aside the Iraqis and try to win the war for them. Same thing we did in Vietnam, by the way. Marginalize the Army of Republic in Vietnam because we were the big, brave Americans, and we were going to defeat the VC and the NVA and hand the Republic of Vietnam back to the citizens. So it's a brilliant essay, dissent of a particular kind. There are other contributors whose dissent is one in which they are emphatically and unreservedly anti-war. All wars are wrong, to include the war in which I participated. So there's a wide range. I think that one of the strengths of the collection is that there's a wide range of views, a wide range of methods of expressing dissent through protest activities or through writing. The first guy I referred to, after he got out of the Army, he got a PhD at Northwestern, and he's now teaching at the Air Force Academy. And basically what he says, I'm at the Air Force Academy because I want to make sure that it's not that he's hoping we get involved in more wars, but if we get involved in more wars, I want to have officers running that war that have a better understanding than the officers who ran the Iraq War. And they don't just assume that we can take over somebody else's country and somebody else's fate. So wide variety of views. I think actually they're quite wonderful, but we'll see how it works when it comes out in August.
Well, I look forward to reading that then too, and this is one of the things that that really is influential for me is reading perspectives of veterans who had a certain perspective and then changed their minds. Journalists, the same kind of thing.
A lot of mind changing in this collection. Yeah.
Right.
Hey, look, I really enjoyed this conversation and appreciate it.
Me too. Thanks so much. And again, for those of you out there, I hope you understand the whole nature of the podcast, which is to try and really interview people who have thought critically and researched these controversial issues, whether it's the U.S. role in the world, or it has to do with our food system. When we spoke to Joel Salatin last time, there's a number of different things that are controversial, but instead of screaming at each other over this, there are books that you can read. And Dr. Andrew Bacevich has a plethora of those books that you can read from and really think about this so that we can hopefully avoid or reduce the amount of unnecessary wars that we're engaged in the future. Thank you so much for speaking with us today, Dr. Bacevich.
Thank you, and good luck with your own teaching and research.
Thank you.